Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Missouri Trailblazers program on Vincent Price, brought to you today by the Missouri State Museum. My name is Pam. I'm the branch lead here at the Holt Summit Public Library, which is a branch of the Daniel Boone Regional Library. And joining me today is Lauren, who is the Adult and Community Services Manager for Daniel Boone. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, Pam.
Okay, before I introduce today's presenter, I would like to go over a few Zoom housekeeping items. On your Zoom screen, if you hover or tap, you should see a raised hand icon and a chat bubble icon. Everyone's microphones are currently muted. If you'd like to ask a question at the end of the presentation, select the hand icon and Lauren will unmute you. You can also enter your questions and comments into the chat, which I will be monitoring. Today's program is being recorded and will be made available on the museum's Facebook page and the library's YouTube channel after it has been edited. Also, if you're watching with a group, please let us know how many are watching at your location by putting it into the chat. All right, let's get started. Today's program is a continuation of the Missouri Trailblazers series featuring the Trailblazers who have impacted Missouri. I would like to say a special thank you to the Missouri State Museum for their partnership in organizing these presentations. I will now turn things over to Angela Wells, who is the Education Specialist for the Missouri State Museum, located in Jefferson City, Missouri. Angela, would you like to say a few things about what's going on at the museum?
Thank you, Pam. I just have a couple of brief things to mention. The first being that we now have available at the State Museum and Jefferson Landing State Historic Site take-home activity packets for kids to pick up. So they can come and pick up a packet that's going to have information on a specific topic. So right now we have available one that I just finished today on Missouri dinosaurs, the Missouri State Dinosaur. We have one available on shadow puppets, where they make their own shadow puppets and shadow puppet theater. And then we also have one on stained glass of the Missouri Capitol building. So basically they'll learn a little bit about whatever the topic is, and then there'll be an activity in the packet that they can complete at home. Especially when it's hot outside, it's a nice thing to do when you can sit in the air conditioning and complete a project with your family. These are free of charge. All you have to do is come up to the museum tour desk and ask for an activity packet, and you can pick the topic that you're interested in. And the same goes for Jefferson Landing State Historic Site. So you can visit either location and pick up one of these packets. Another thing I want to briefly mention is our backyard concert series. We have another one coming up on August 27th. So just throwing that date out there for those who might be interested in that. Otherwise, the State Museum, just a reminder, is open Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, and then Saturday and Sunday, 9 to 4. So enjoy today's program. Thank you.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you, Angela. Appreciate it. All right. Well, today's program, like I said earlier, is about Vincent Price. We welcome Lucas Schwartz with us today. Lucas has been an interpretive resource specialist with the Missouri State Museum for 5 years, providing interpretation on a variety of topics relevant to Missouri's history and natural resources. Lucas obtained a BA in archaeology from Washington University in St. Louis and an MA in anthropology from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And now I'll turn things over to Lucas. Thank you, Lucas.
Hey, everyone. I'm glad you could join me today. And real quick, I'm going to share the screen to get my presentation up here for you. All right, so like we said, we're going to be talking a little bit about Vincent Price today. Now, I'm sure that's a name a lot of folks here recognize. He's a pretty well-known actor, but I was actually very surprised to learn he was from Missouri. So, of course, why Vincent Price? I'm a little young, so I might not have been seeing his films growing up. But you know what? He actually did have very broad appeal. I'm an older millennial, so I, of course, remember him from Edward Scissorhands, and I heard him in Michael Jackson's song Thriller. That's a pretty popular replay around Halloween. And of course, I'm personally a fan of horror films. And then when I started researching famous Missourians for the Trailblazers program here, I was actually very surprised to learn he was from St. Louis. Now, additionally, I learned he was involved in a lot more than just horror films, and I kind of wanted to share some of that with you all today. Now, not only was he a trailblazer in film, creating these really debonair yet sympathetic villains, but he was also a trailblazer in bringing fine arts to the public and in celebrity cooking. Now, like I said, he was born in St. Louis, May 27th, 1911. Is actually kind of dubbed the Candy Kid because of his father, Vincent Price Sr., who ran the National Candy Company. Now, his family was actually a fairly well-to-do family in St. Louis, thanks to his grandfather, Vincent Clarence Price, who was the fellow who invented the first cream of tartar-based baking powder, Dr. Price's baking powder. He also dabbled a little bit in creating food extracts and actually created his own brand of cereal as well. And then he turned over the business, the National Candy Company, to Vincent Price Sr. Vincent Price Sr. would move their family to St. Louis, and because he kind of got wind that the 1904 World's Fair would be hosted in St. Louis, and he wanted to set up a booth at the fair. Thanks to that booth he set up, the National Candy Company actually really became a very well-known and respected candy company. And they primarily specialized in penny candies, which actually kept the business afloat during the Great Depression because penny candy was about all anyone could really afford. And thanks to that, Vincent Jr. was actually able to stay in college because his father had gone to Yale University and unfortunately had to drop out early because there was a stock market crash and he'd had to leave to help support his family. Vincent Price, the actor, though, he was able to stay in college throughout his college years thanks to his father's kind of business acumen with the National Candy Company. Now, early on in his life, there were really a lot of signs of some of his adult passions growing up. Now, of course, as I mentioned before, food was definitely a family tradition. Between the cereal and the baking powder, the candy company, it seemed inevitable that Vincent Price was going to be drawn to food. But he was also very, very interested in art. They say that one of the first things he did when he was growing up was start collecting these art books and looking through art books that his sisters would leave behind when they left the house. He also spent a lot of time at St. Louis museums, especially the St. Louis Art Museum. And finally, by the time he was 12 years old, he found a piece of art at one of the galleries there in St. Louis that he just could not pass up. It was this Rembrandt etching I've got here, the two nude models, one standing. He was absolutely captivated by it. Now, it was being sold for $37.50, which of course he couldn't afford at that time, but he ended up putting down $5 and telling the art dealer that, look, I will work all year long in order to pay this off in installments. Granted, the Price family was pretty well known in St. Louis, so I'm sure the art dealer knew he was going to be good for it, but he agreed to let him do it in installments. He did work all year long doing odd jobs, saving up allowance, and he finally did purchase his first piece of art at 12 years old. And then, as for acting, he started acting in school plays and actually got a bit role at about 3 years old playing this little water sprite for one of his sister's plays. Now, he was just supposed to be kind of on set as almost a prop, really. They just needed a little boy with blonde curly hair. So he's 3 years old, running around on stage, and he ended up stealing the show because he would ad-lib lines and just do all kinds of antics on there while the kids are all telling him, no, you need to stay putting your lowly role down here. Now, continuing on growing up, he would continue putting on plays for his family, but he never really did any professional acting, at least not until he got into his college years. Now, Vincent graduated from Yale University in 1933 and then moved on to London to study at the Courtauld Institute. He'd originally intended to major in art history. And then, kind of on a dare, he was told to audition for a role in the upcoming play Chicago. Because he spent so much time watching plays, he really got to know the actors down around the area. Now, Vincent insisted the only reason he got this role was because he could walk and chew gum at the same time. And gum wasn't really popular in the British Isles at that time, so it wasn't a skill a lot of the Brits had picked up. Well, the play was moderately successful. And like I said, the play Chicago, it's actually the play that the musical would later be based on. Then they changed the name of the play to Play Ball in order to distinguish it from the musical. Now, after his success with Chicago, he decided to try out for another play, Victoria Regina. And he was going to co-star as the Prince consort in this play, Prince Albert, because like Prince Albert, he was very tall. People said he looked very similar to a young Prince Albert. And because he traveled pretty extensively in Germany in his youth, he was actually able to affect a believable German accent. And this play was a smash hit. He was absolutely floored by how successful it was. And in fact, the playwright, Lawrence Houseman, the fellow who wrote Victoria Regina, Whenever he was approached by producers to see about getting it sent over to Broadway, Houseman told them that he would only sell them the rights to play it on Broadway if Vincent Price would go with the play. Well, they agreed to that, and Vincent Price ended up playing in Victoria, Regina on Broadway alongside a fairly famous actress named Helen Hayes, with whom he formed a pretty close friendship that would last the rest of their lives. Now, from play acting, he did end up making his first film about 2 years later, 1938, in a Service Deluxe. This is this kind of screwball romance comedy. And it was also pretty successful, even though if you asked Vincent, he'd say it was an absolutely atrocious film. But it was pretty standard fare for the time. Now, he was offered a contract from his film studio to do more films, but he talked to his friend Helen Hayes and, kind of asked her for her advice. Well, she ended up telling him, well, look, do you know your craft? Well, what do you mean by that? Do you know all the kind of ins and outs of acting? Because if you don't want to be just another flash in the pan, you really need to nail down how to act. So he actually turned down that offer to be signed on by a studio and went back to stage acting for a while. He would do summer stock theater, doing things like Shakespeare. He would do some experimental plays. Some were great, some were panned, but it really kind of taught him a lot about how to act while he was acting in front of a live audience. And then later on, he would come back and do another film called The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex. Now, you got a romantic comedy, you've got a historical drama. Early on in his career, he was starting to kind of look like he might be more of a matinee idol rather than, a character actor. Now, his first brush with really kind of horror didn't come until 1939's Tower of London. And that was really more of a historical drama that just kind of had some horrific elements to it rather than being a dedicated horror film. And then in 1940, we've got The Return of the Invisible Man. And The Invisible Man was originally a horror film, but the second film in the franchise was more of a sci-fi thriller than really a horror film. Actually, according to his daughter's biography of him, Victoria Price, she said that less than a third of the 100+ films that he starred in were actually horror films. Now, most of the films he actually did were historical dramas and rom-coms, and he even played in a couple of westerns. For example, he played in The Baron of Arizona, which, if you've ever seen, stars another Missouri man, a very famous Missouri con man who tried to convince the U.S. government that he owned the entire territory of Arizona. Of course, after he starred in these films, he hadn't really set himself up as a character actor in the horror genre either. So he continued acting in a lot of these historical dramas. Now, by 1953, though, he found himself in a little bit of trouble. At this time, the Red Scare was really sweeping through Hollywood. There were a lot of Hollywood actors, producers, directors being blacklisted by Hollywood for suspicion of being communist or having communist sympathies. Unfortunately for Vincent, he was very liberal in his political beliefs, and that ended up getting him not on the blacklist, but what was called the gray list. So a lot of the producers and directors were afraid he might get blacklisted or might get accused, so they weren't hiring him anyways. And that was actually one of the big fears of his life, was not being able to work and thus not being able to support his family. He actually stressed out quite a bit about it. And in the end, his wife suggested to him, okay, well, you got all this downtime anyways. Why don't you write a biography? So he did just that. He spent most of 1953 writing I Like What I Know, the first of the biographies he ever wrote. But even that wasn't quite enough to put him at peace. And in the end, he volunteered to speak before the FBI. They interviewed him, and they were finally able to clear him of being a communist. And they did give him paperwork to say that they had cleared him, which he held on to for the rest of his life, just out of fear that he might ever be accused of it again. Now, towards the end of 1953, though, he starred in a film which would really define the rest of his acting career, House of Wax. It was the big horror film that really kind of reimagined his career and revitalized his career after getting off of that gray list. Now, his unique voice really created this debonair, malevolent villain. However, his villains, not just in this film, but going forward, were often very sympathetic characters as well. No, they're often seen as, the victims of fate striking back at the world. Actually, in an interview he did later on, he put out a quote that I think really kind of sums up his view of it as well. He said, "I don't play monsters. I play men besieged by fate and out for revenge." Now, even in his non-horror roles from this point going forward, he started leaning more towards antagonist roles. For example, as Baca the Taskmaster in Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments. Now, you'll notice that the poster here for House of Wax, notice that the film was done in 3D. It was actually the first color film done in 3D. And at the time, people thought 3D was really going to revolutionize the film industry. Now, today, we just kind of look at it as more of a gimmick, really. We don't really see it as revolutionizing the TV industry. But this wasn't the only gimmick film he ended up starring in. In fact, he starred in a number of the William Castle directed films, and William Castle was very well known for his gimmicky films. For example, he directed The House on Haunted Hill, and he used this gimmick called emergo, in which he would have pulleys flying plastic skeletons around the theater ceiling during a certain scene near the end of that movie. And he also starred in a film for William Castle called The Tingler, in which he was using this gimmick he called Percepto. And all that really was he had these little airplane de-icing motors that he would strap to the seats of certain audience members' chairs. And then whenever the tingling sensation from the monster was going up the spines in the movie, he'd have it set to go off in the theater to make people feel like they had the tingling sensation going up their spines. Now, his status as a horror icon really took off with the Edgar Allan Poe cycle that he did for Roger Corman, who was a part of American International Pictures. Now, these were all done back in the 1960s, and they did with Vincent Price, The House of Usher, Pit and the Pendulum, Tales of Terror, The Raven, The Haunted Palace, The Mask of the Red Death, and The Tomb of Ligeia. Now, some of these were meant to be faithful adaptations of the Poe story. Others were almost spoofs of the Poe story. For example, The Raven, it's a fairly well-known poem, but there's definitely not enough to get a full feature film out of. So it ended up being just kind of very, very loosely inspired by Poe rather than anything actually really related to the story. And of those stories that I read off, actually, one of them, The Haunted Palace, wasn't even based off the Poe story at all. It was based off an old H.P. Lovecraft story and then just given the title of one of Poe's poems. Of course, American International Pictures did that pretty frequently, given the success of the Edgar Allan Poe films that Vincent Price was in. For example, they would go on to name the film The Conqueror Worm after a Poe poem, even though it was actually a historical drama. And then just to try to make it seem somewhat relevant, they ended up reading the poem The Conqueror Worm at the end credits scene of the film. Now, these films were extremely popular with the drive-in crowds especially. So Vincent, by the time he's doing this, he's getting into his 40s and 50s. He's kind of at the stage where a lot of actors are starting to really kind of lose name recognition. But because these were so popular in drive-in theaters, not only was Vincent's name really starting to spread again, but is spreading amongst younger audiences. So he's able to really kind of keep this connection with younger audiences every time one of these horror films would come out. Now, he didn't just do horror films. He was definitely not afraid to ham it up outside of the horror genre. Oh, for example, in addition to some of those really serious Poe horror villains, he would do less serious villainous roles, like in the James Bond spoof film, Dr. Goldfoot, which was kind of a spoof on both Dr. No and Goldfinger. He was also a recurring villain in the old Adam West Batman series called Egghead, which would use, egg-themed weapons and make these horrible egg puns all throughout the episode. He also had guest appearances in The Brady Bunch. He was in a couple episodes of Scooby-Doo. He even got a guest appearance on The Muppet Show. That's one of the more memorable appearances. I know I see this image come up on Facebook pretty regularly around Halloween, in which Vincent, he got to really let loose his sense of humor while maintaining that kind of campy horror image that he was so well known for. Now, he did continue live acting as well throughout his career, although early on and later on, he was more heavily involved with live theater, but kind of throughout the middle part of his career, he really let it taper off a bit. Like I said, before he signed on with the studio, he really spent a lot of time doing like stock theater early on to try to hone his acting craft. And he even joined Orson Welles' Mercury Theater when it was around. Then once he really got heavy into the film industry, he didn't quite have the time to do the live acting like he used to. And near the end of his life, he finally got back into it. It was most well known for this play I've got a picture of up here, Diversions and Delights. Now, for getting back into live theater, he sure chose a difficult one because this was a one-man show. It was depicting Oscar Wilde, who's just been released from prison, is lecturing in order to try to raise some funds. But it's often been said that this performance was the best performance of his life. Now, people raved about it. He went on to perform this one for years. It was very, very popular. Unfortunately, it was never put to film, but there is an audio recording of it, which you can actually find on YouTube. So if you'd like to hear him performing as Oscar Wilde, it is still possible to do so. Now, even at the end of his career, his works continue to have very broad appeal. Like I said, I'm an older millennial, and even I recognize his name. He was the inventor from Edward Scissorhands. Of course, I recognize the narration from Michael Jackson's Thriller. And at the time, I didn't realize it, but he was even the villain in The Great Mouse Detective. So his works, like I said, he has had young fans throughout his entire life because he's always been able to appeal to younger audiences. Now, his film career spanned 57 years, with his final credited role in a TV film, The Heart of Justice, in 1992. Now, before he started acting, though, like I said, originally he wanted to be an art historian. So he graduated Yale in 1933 with a degree in English and a minor in art history, and he intended to pursue a master's degree in art history at the Courtauld Institute in London. Now, he moved out to London in 1934 and was there for about a year before he decided to jump onto acting full-time in 1935. Now, he would often joke that sometimes he'd take these absolutely atrocious film roles simply because he wanted to enjoy the local art shops at the location they were setting up at. And he was a big-time collector of art, especially Native American art. He was really, really in love with Native American art. He would travel not just around the United States, but even down to South America, picking up pieces of Native art that he could display. And towards that end, he became such an expert in Native art that he was named to the Indian Arts and Crafts Boards for the Department of the Interior for 14 years. He even served as a commissioner of that department. He was named there during the Eisenhower administration. Now, he served for 14 years, and when he finally did decide to step down, according to a Native American artist, Oscar Howe, he claimed that when Vincent left, he had specifically requested that a Native American replace him as commissioner of the board. So he's very much a proponent of Native American rights as well. He didn't just want to be representing them. He also wanted them to help represent themselves. Now, this wouldn't be the only work that he did for the government for the arts. He actually even served on the White House Commission of Fine Arts under First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy and the Johnson administration. And in that role, he was responsible for helping to select some of the artworks that would be put up on display in the White House. Now, Vincent also believed that he should use his celebrity status to help push for an appreciation of the arts among the everyday person. And some of the first public awareness of his appreciation for the arts really came from this game show called the $64,000 Challenge. Now, this was a game show based off of the $64,000 question, in which people would be brought in and they would say, "Okay, I'm an expert in this subject," and then the show's host would quiz them on that subject, kind of like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, only more dedicated to a subject that you're supposedly an expert in. Now, by the time Vincent joined, he was being put up against a jockey, Eddie Robinson, to see who knew art better. Unfortunately, the shows all kind of fell under a little bit of public scrutiny after it was revealed that a number of the game shows at that time were actually rigging their contests. But even after the rigging scandal came out, Vincent wasn't, just burned by the experience. He continued to show up on game shows pretty regularly, as well as lecturing at universities on art. And actually, one of the more famous game show appearances he would do was Hollywood Squares. He did that for a number of years, and I'd actually highly recommend looking up some old videos of that, because you can find copies of that with him on it on YouTube, and he is absolutely hilarious in those clips. Now, Vincent really felt that there was this kind of misconception by the public that art was only for the very wealthy. He actually wanted to help make it as accessible to everyone as he could. Now, given that he had a pretty good reputation for being knowledgeable about art after, the game shows and some of those lectures he'd given, Sears reached out to him when they were getting ready to put together a art collection to sell out of their stores and catalogs. Now, at first, he was a little on the fence about it. He wasn't sure that he could really trust Sears to do right by it. So ultimately, he decided to give them a caveat if he was going to accept the offer. He said, okay, I will help you all with advertising for your art department here if I get to be the one who picks out all of the art that you sell. Sears agreed to that. So Vincent actually spent years traveling around selecting art pieces that Sears would then sell in their catalogs and stores. Now, they were actually selling original pieces of art. These weren't prints, these weren't copies, they were original artwork, which could be bought for anywhere between $10 and $3,000, and they could be paid for in installments. And it's estimated that between 1962 and 1971, when they were running this, they sold over 50,000 pieces of original art. Now, Vincent, in order to help the sales associates at Sears sell the art, even put together an instructional video to help train sales associates in what to look for and how to sell this art. And there is a copy of that on YouTube as well, which you can still view. Now, for over 30 years, Vincent would often give lectures on art at universities, including a number of lectures at Truman State University. He really felt the need that students needed to be immersed in the arts that they were studying. And towards that end, he and his wife, Mary, ended up donating over 90 pieces of original art from their personal collection to the East Los Angeles College. And this would become the seed of what would eventually become the Vincent Price Art Museum at the East Los Angeles College. Now, this is a museum that really kind of serves as a resource, not just for students today, but also for the public. So anyone in the public is allowed to go in and kind of immerse themselves in the artwork that's in there and study a little bit about it. Now then, in addition to art, Vincent was a collector of recipes. He absolutely loved to cook, not just for himself, but for friends and family. If he ate out at a restaurant somewhere and it was a dish that he really liked, oftentimes he would reach out to the chef at the restaurant and ask them to teach him how to cook it. And this wasn't just fine dining either. He didn't limit himself just to the high-end restaurants. In fact, one of his favorite dishes was the hot dog from Dodger Stadium, the old Dodgers dog. Now, of course, much as he did with fine art, he decided to use his celebrity status to kind of help share his passion for cooking with the public. Here he did some advertisements for this bitters company, and as part of the advertisement, he decided to list out a recipe of what you can make with those bitters in addition to making drinks with them. And then naturally, Vincent Price, being something of a ham, had to ham it up for the audiences even while cooking. One of the most famous instances of those is when he cooked a trout in a dishwasher on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. So this is November of 1975. He had gotten on the show and talked a little bit about art beforehand and also talked about his passion for cooking. And he told Johnny Carson that they were going to cook something there on the show for them. So he took him off to the side. They had all the ingredients listed out. He kind of went through everything you need to do to prepare the trout, some wine stewed pears, some vegetables. And then they rolled out a dishwasher because before the show, they cooked it up. So he had it still in the dishwasher, still hot. They pulled it out and he had Johnny Carson and some of the other guests on the show try it out. It's an absolutely hilarious segment too. At one point, they decide they need to test the wine that he's using to make sure it's good. So they're both passing the bottle back and forth, taking sips. There are clips of it on YouTube. And if you're going to look for it, I'd actually recommend looking for the full 20-minute segment, because Vincent Price was known for being a horror actor, but he could have very easily been a comedian. He was absolutely hilarious. Now, he was also one of the first celebrities to have his own cooking show. Now, a lot of times you hear of celebrity chefs, they're chefs who became celebrities, but he was one of the first celebrities who then became a chef on a cooking show. This was Cooking Price-Wise. It was only aired on the British Broadcasting Channel, so it's aired in the UK only. Unfortunately, you can't find any videos of it anymore, not that I'm aware of. But they did release a cookbook along with the show, and you can still get a copy of that book. And that's not actually the only cookbook he released. He released multiple cookbooks. Now, this show came about because he'd become fairly well known for being a gourmand. And so the UK, they contacted him and said, you know, we want to kind of set up a show where you can demonstrate how people can make exotic or high-end dishes from the things that they can find at their local grocery store. Now, he was very much a believer that fine dining didn't have to be limited only to those who could afford to go to the expensive restaurants or travel to exotic locales. So they would actually travel around to these little grocery stores in England, make sure that they had the ingredients to make it there, and then they would demonstrate how to cook it on that show. Now, the cookbook itself, you can actually still get. It was reprinted. His daughter, Victoria, went around and had a lot of his old cookbooks reprinted, so they're now actually very easily accessible. Most of them you can pick up on Amazon. Now, here are just a few of the cookbooks he released. You know, we've got Come Into the Kitchen cookbook, released by him and his wife, Mary. Actually, he and Mary did most of the cookbooks together. A Treasury of Great Recipes, which was actually a fairly common household cookbook. It was pretty widely distributed. Then we've got the National Treasury Cookery, which is actually 5 volumes documenting different eras of cooking in America's history. So, you know, we've got recipes of Victorian America. They've got a colonial America in there. And then, of course, the Cooking Price-Wise cookbook, which came out with that show that Vincent did. Like I said, Victoria Price did a lot of work to get those reprinted, so you can still pick them up today. And actually, it's become kind of a popular trend on some blog sites that are dedicated to like horror or Vincent Price, to have Vincent Price cook and watch alongs, where they'll watch one of his films and cook some of the recipes. Now, the influence of Vincent Price was pretty wide-reaching and lasts even today. You know, while most people recognize him from his work in horror films, of course, his other passions have really come to influence the world, even if more subtly. You know, his Treasury of Great Recipes was a mainstay in countless homes, and many Americans acquired fine art through his work with Sears. Additionally, through the donations to the East Los Angeles College, students and art lovers from around the world have the opportunity to study many original pieces of art, which might have just otherwise ended up in private collections. And then he often joked that, you know, when they do celebrity birthdays in cities, if St. Louis were to ever do a celebrity birthday, they'd probably just hang him from the arch. But for his 100th anniversary, or his 100th birthday rather, St. Louis actually hosted what they called the Vincentennial. And he was even inducted into the St. Louis Walk of Fame. So he's got a star on both the St. Louis and the Hollywood Walk of Fame. But does anyone have any questions? We kind of flew through a lot of information there.
I have a couple questions for you, Lucas.
All righty.
One was the rap that Michael Jackson's Thriller the only time that Vincent worked on a musical album?
Actually, it wasn't. So in addition to working with Michael Jackson, he also worked with Alice Cooper. Surprise, surprise. He did the narrator as the Black Widow, rather. He was the narrator in there. He also starred in the movie that Alice Cooper did based off of the Black Widow. And then later on, for a live version of Deep Purple's The Butterfly Ball and the Grasshopper's Feast, he served as the narrator in that one. So you did a little bit of work with musicians.
Okay, I have another question for you.
All righty.
Was Vincent accused of taking part in the game show rigging scandal himself?
Now, he himself was not accused of it, although a lot of people suspected he might have. And he actually interviewed, stood before a grand jury about it and said, okay, I wasn't ever fed any of the answers. Although he did note that sometimes what would happen is when he'd go in to talk to the show's producer about the upcoming show, they might, screen some of the questions by him, say, okay, here's the question, but then they wouldn't indicate whether or not the answer he gave was right. That seemed like a fairly common thing with that game show rigging, was they screen the questions, no, give you the answer, because it's not like you've got a phone in your pocket, you can look up the answer to it before that night. But yeah, it really did kind of leave a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, and those game shows really kind of dropped in popularity for a while there. But Vincent was thankfully a very knowledgeable individual about art anyway, so it was very easy to believe that he actually was knowledgeable when he was answering those questions rather than being fed the answers.
You also mentioned that he wrote an autobiography and cookbooks. Did he write any other books?
Yes, he did. So in addition to the cookbooks and that autobiography, he wrote syndicated columns, and he even wrote a book about his dog Joe called The Book of Joe, because he was kind of heartbroken after his dog Joe passed away, and he wanted to kind of make a little tribute to Joe. But he did a lot of writing about art especially, and he also wrote a book called A National Treasury of Art. He really liked that title, A National Treasury of. So yeah, he was a pretty prolific writer.
Can I ask a quick question, Lucas?
Yes.
You mentioned, I guess his daughter said that actually that the majority of his films and acting weren't actually horror films, but or horror roles. But I think, me personally, I'm almost 50, and that's what I think of when I think of Vincent Price. Did anything in your research indicate that he ever felt pigeonholed by that, or wished that his legacy was less narrow, or did he, just kind of enjoy that reputation?
I think it kind of depended on when you asked him in his career. So at one point in his career, yes, he did definitely feel like he's kind of shoehorned into just that one role. He's kind of worried about being typecast, but on the other hand, he grew up in the Depression. He was deathly afraid of being without work. So he was willing to take almost any role he could get, as long as it, provided steady work and meant he could continue providing for his family. But he would often complain about some of the terrible roles that were being offered to him, especially once the horror films weren't as popular as they once were. And that was actually part of why his third wife, Coral Brown, had encouraged him to do the live play Diversions and Delights, because it would be a chance for him to, really work his acting chops and do something outside of the horror genre. Now, of course, he always tried to make the best of whatever he was given too. So whenever he did get these horror roles, he'd kind of camp it up and try to have fun with it. There are a number of films, though, his answer always would vary. What's the worst film you were ever in? And he'd say, oh, this was the worst film. Oh, no, this was the worst film. But again, he seemed like he was having a lot of fun with it. And sometimes that was the only good thing about the film. When if you watch it, you see Vincent just kind of enjoying himself while the rest of the film is just absolutely dreadful.
Does anybody else have a question out there? I'm going to wait to see if one pops up in the chat. I do have another one for you.
All righty.
Given that he had a very distinctive voice, did he ever consider a career in radio other than film?
He actually did do a little bit of radio. So for a while there, he actually played as the Saint in the radio syndication of the Saint, the Simon Templar. He was the Saint from mid-1940s, 1947 to 1951. So he did that for a number of years. And then later on in his career, after he had gotten kind of pigeonholed into doing horror, he even did a show called The Price of Fear, in which they would do kind of radio narrations of these short, scary stories. Some of them, I believe, did get put on YouTube as well. So like The Man Who Hated Scenes is another pretty good one. It's fairly short, like maybe 20 minutes. He did that from 1973 to 1983, I believe it was, so about 10 years.
Do you know if any of his family, I don't know if his daughter, you said he had a daughter, or anybody else that carried on in his line of work in any capacity, whether it be art or acting?
So he had both a son and a daughter, Vincent Barrett Price. His son grew up to become a poet and anthropologist, and his daughter Victoria is a motivational speaker, personal guide. She also really does kind of help to carry on the Vincent Price legacy. So like she did the Vincent Price biography. I got a lot of this from Vincent Price, a daughter's biography. And it wasn't just her perspective of it. She did a lot of research into his early life and tried to be fairly objective about a lot of it. And she regularly goes to like horror conventions or Vincent Price conventions to kind of speak on her father's behalf. Now, while she herself is admittedly not a fan of horror films, she does describe herself as a fan of horror fans. And she actually says that she never really liked horror films because who would like seeing their father being killed in all these films?
We have another question for you.
Yes.
Angela asked, did you say his portrayal of Oscar Wilde was seen as controversial at the time?
At the time, not especially, although he was kind of doing this at around the same time that the AIDS epidemic was starting to spread around. So any depictions of a homosexual individual was a little controversial. In fact, he got into a bit of a fight with the anti-gay rights activist, Anita Bryant, who, really kind of poo-pooed on him for portraying Oscar Wilde. But Vincent's response to that was, well, I believe Oscar's already answered you when he wrote the story, A Woman of No Importance. Vincent was quite the wit too. He definitely was the perfect fit to play Oscar Wilde.
Do we have any other questions out there? How about Lucas? Is there anything that you found most interesting in your research when you were coming up with this program about Vincent?
Oh, there was a lot that was really interesting. Like I said, he was actually a very early advocate for gay rights at that time. His daughter later came out to him as being lesbian, and he kind of indicated he may have been bi at that time. So, he said, oh, I understand just how you feel. I've had all these really close relationships with the men in my life, and all my wives have been jealous. And she later on said that she's almost as certain as she can be that he was bisexual. He even was an honorary member of the gay rights organization PFLAG. But yeah, what probably the thing that amazed me the most though was just his humor. He was absolutely hilarious, and you might not have gotten that if you're only watching these horror films where he's playing these serious evil characters. So he could have very easily been a comedic actor.
Lauren, do you have any other questions for Lucas? Well, we did get a nod from one of our attendees saying it was really great, and there was many things that she didn't know about Vincent Price, and she wanted to thank you. So,
well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well, we want to thank everyone for joining us today. We ask that you, if you're not busy in August, you might join us again for another Missouri Trailblazers program. This time highlighting the political careers of Lewis and Clark, and it will be on the third Tuesday in August at 1 o'clock. Please visit the Daniel Boone websites for any past events, as well as the Missouri State Museum's website as well. Lucas, we want to thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us this afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you. Have a great day.
Take care, everyone.